Hello there, and welcome to my video on making artisan bread. This is a four-part video series in which we'll look at what artisan bread is, how it's made, how it's baked, and then a little experiment or investigation on how much energy it takes to bake artisan bread at home. First off, my apologies, I'm getting over a sinus cold, so that's why I sound a little different than I would otherwise normally. Okay, first part of this video series is what is artisan bread? So there's not a clear or a formal definition of artisan bread. If you look online, you'll read different things, but in general, I think it's accepted that artisan bread involves a handmade product, handmade bread that is made by a quote-unquote skilled craftsman, as opposed to some automated machinery that's going to produce the bread in high volume. It uses simple ingredients like flour, water, salt, yeast or leaven, and thyme. It requires radiant and abundant heat and moisture in order to create the crunchy crust and the moist crumb inside the bread. Baking this type of bread is best accomplished in a hearth oven, but can be emulated in a conventional oven with the assistance of either a baking stone or, as we'll see in a minute, a Dutch oven. So we need a baking stone, high baking temperature, and the addition of moisture using a water sprayer. The open baking stone allows for a variety of bread loaf shapes, but this baking technique generally suffers from a suboptimal moisture and radiant heat environment, though the results are still very favorable. Using a cast iron based Dutch oven in place of a baking stone addresses both the moisture and radiant heat issues, but at the cost of accommodating a variety of loaf shapes. Basically, you're going to have a round loaf. By keeping a lid on the Dutch oven, the water vapor escaping the dough becomes concentrated around the loaf, and in combination with the radiant heat from the walls of the Dutch oven produces a lustrous and crunchy crust while also encouraging a moist crumb. And in the latter videos I'll show you baking bread using both the baking stone and the cast iron Dutch oven. What's bread made of? The main ingredients are water, flour, yeast or leaven, and salt. Flour is primarily either white flour or whole wheat flour, or some combination of the two. The flour contains gluten, which is a mixture of two proteins which is responsible and necessary for the elastic nature of dough. It traps the carbon dioxide gas bubbles and expands when it's baking. It also helps the dough to keep its shape if it's freestanding. I have a link there for some nutritional comparisons of flours. Generally, a higher protein flour will have higher gluten content and will thereby be more elastic and be able to hold its shape better if it's in a freestanding form versus being in some kind of a baking pan or pot. Yeast or leaven, this can be active dry yeast, which is probably what's most familiar to the viewer here. It's activated when water is added, and it's fed with some kind of sugar. Could be the sugars in the flour or a little bit of table sugar. Natural yeast, which is developed from the yeast that is naturally found on wheat berries, grape skins, etc. We'll talk more about this in the coming slides. And then, of course, salt. And I didn't mention here, but thyme is a significant ingredient, so to speak, that is critical for making a good artisan bread. Yeast is a single-cell microorganism that is part of the fungus kingdom, and we'll talk about two different types of yeast. The baker's yeast converts the fermentable sugars present in the dough into carbon dioxide and ethanol. It's the same species but a different strain commonly used in alcoholic fermentation, which is called brewer's yeast. It's also a single-cell microorganism found on and around the human body. This is the yeast that you would find in your grocery store. It's a granular type of yeast in little packets in the baking aisle, and it's activated when it is hydrated. Wild yeast, also known as S. minor yeast, it's a wild yeast found on plants, fruits, and grains that is occasionally used for baking. In general, it's not used in a pure form, but comes from being propagated in a sourdough starter or leaven, and that's what I'm going to talk more about and use when I go through showing you how to make this artisan bread. So bread dough requires some leavening agent. Either can be active dry yeast, As I mentioned already, it's this granular yeast that is typically found in a small sealed packet in your baking aisle, or natural wild yeast, which is leavening that is grown in a water and flour mixture. And that is, again, what we will use here. So the wild yeast starter is known as the chef. It's a pancake batter consistency mixture of water and flour in which natural wild yeast is grown. The chef is created in an approximately 4-day process and can be kept for a long time. The chef that I've had maybe for 10 years or more. Once you do it, you just maintain it and keep it in the fridge when you're not using it, and it will just last and last. So the way you start it, though, is you use some freshly ground wheat flour and water, mix them together, and you leave them to ferment at room temperature. On a daily basis, a portion of the mixture is discarded, and fresh water and white flour is added. No yeast is ever explicitly added, but the freshly ground wheat, which is initially used, will be accompanied by some yeast which is naturally present on the outer shell of the wheat berry. Alternatively, grape skins are sometimes temporarily added to the flour. Let's say you just have white flour available from the store, so white flour and sugar, or white flour and water, and the natural yeast on the grape skin will then start to be fed by the sugars in the flour. After several days, bubbles within the batter will begin to form and will increase over the remaining days. I'll show you some pictures of this in the following video. There are two parts to a natural yeast process. So there's the chef. This is the pancake batter consistency mixture in which the wild yeast is grown and maintained. It's stored in the refrigerator and is refreshed every few weeks or whenever a batch of bread is made. I've left mine for several months in the refrigerator, and although it takes a little bit more refreshing, and by refreshing I mean you dump much of it and then you add fresh water and flour and leave it out at room temperature for a day or so. You can always bring it back. So like I said, I've had mine for at least 10 years, and it's pretty robust. The leaven then is a dough consistency mixture that's created from the chef, and once proofed, in other words, once you give it some time to sit and ferment, or to grow, it's used to make the bread dough. So it's created by adding flour to the chef and then letting it proof for 6 to 12 hours. So you just basically take this pancake batter mixture and you thicken it by adding in significant enough flour to make it a clumpy, drier mixture. The remaining portions of this video series, parts 2 through 4, I will pictorially walk through the making of some artisan bread, and then in part 4 I'll report on an experiment which estimated the energy efficiency of baking artisan bread